we finally got into Rye's church, so the Church of All Saints in Rye's. To blink you can miss it because it's just covered by the trees. Now, I recall this church being, I thought of a tower, but I've clearly got it confused with something else. It has a spire. It's a little interesting little church. My real grandfather's first cousin, who was also named Frederick Neville, but Frederick William Neville, was actually christened here, although he was born further down the road. And he was christened here in 1927, but sadly didn't do him a lot of good because he actually died when he was 14 years old. So that wasn't very helpful, really. So he died in 1941. So that was interesting. During the wartime. Now, I'm not quite clear of the reason for his death, but he obviously didn't live very long. And that's my real grandfather's Frederick Allen Neville, who died. His first cousin was here. So the Nevilles have been in this area for quite a predominant of years, and it's no great surprise that the migrational pattern would occur from Ireland over to Scotland over the centuries, from Scotland, from Dunbar down to Ross, into Perthshire, from Perthshire into Northumberland, County Durham, Raby, parts of Shropshire, back into this part of Yorkshire, East Riding, when we come back further down towards Hull. So you can see how the migrational pattern happened over the periods of time. The main name here is Bethel. I do know the name Bethel for a multitude of reasons. It's an interesting surname to really do some track and trace on. And they're certainly the estate owners today. They weren't the estate owners back in the 1096, for example, but they are the estate owners today, and obviously they are by default the church wardens. We met Hugh Bethel very briefly, who just come over to open up the church for us. As sadly, most times the church isn't used a great deal. I was just asking Hugh about how many times the church is used in the year. He says, well, there's a big function room down the road, and they have about, on average, 12 weddings per year. You can imagine back in the day, there would have been a lot more activity. Now, you could argue and say, well, hang on, this church was only built in 1844. That's correct, but it's built on the previous site of previous land and previous buildings. So again, as always, the church seems to use the land from eons ago and rebuild and rebuild and rebuild on it, because it owns the land, so it makes sense to build on its own land once more. So, but this modern construction is actually, this modern part is only 1844. So, which is hard to believe, because it's made to look. Now, the reason why it's hard to believe is because when we look up at the ceiling, we see that wonderful medieval ceiling. And again, it reminds me of St Magnus Cathedral on the Orkney Islands, and it certainly reminds me of the little metal chapel, the Italian chapel on the Orkney Islands that was built by the prisoners of war. You can see we've got the stars and the blues again, representing the heavens and the Enlightenment. And the reason why it looks a lot older is because it is. The main vaults of that came from a local medieval building, and they actually reclaimed all the roof to build this particular church. And that's an original structure up there that's been reclaimed from another building locally. Interesting enough, the slate on the roof is actually Welsh. So it's all from Wales, which is a fair trek to come back in 1844. But it's not that unheard of, because you wouldn't bring it across country, you bring it by ship. You'd go out of the Welsh seas into the Irish Sea, and as long as it sounds, the ship would come right the way around the mainland, right the way through, right round the top of Scotland, back down and deliver it into Hull, because it would be quicker to get it here than it would be to try in 1844 to try and transport that by road, by track. Yes, we could have even trains at that time, but most of the things would have been shipping. And that's what the Hull area is all about, the shipping area and things, totally of that time. In fact, I'll mention Hull here, although we're slightly offset from Hull now, but this is so connected to Hull from a multitude of angles, is that the last boat built in Hull was around the 1927, 1928, and that was the last wooden boat built. So, and it was the only place in the United Kingdom that was still building wooden boats. I mean, large wooden ships. And you can still see some of them down on the dockyards today of Hull, which is quite fascinating from a historical point of view. From a sort of quest point of view, The church is definitely used over the times. The land has been used for many years. It's a Templar connection, obviously, quite clearly, and it still remains so today. In fact, the local masons of this particular province would be donating to its funding cause for the rest of eternity. That wouldn't stop really. So it does get certain funding from certain avenues, really, as most churches do. Lovely parts here. There's quite a nice you can see one of the original. Again, it's made to look rather Gothic in style. Medieval reconstructions, Gothic architectures, Gothic styling. And we can see that from the way that the Christ is represented there. And you can see he's actually on the Tower of Babel. That representation there, he's actually up on the tower. So that's quite interesting. You've got the king desperately writing his wishes and demands on the scroll here at the bottom of the middle panel. And distinctly, you could just about, you could to blink, you'd miss it. But you have the representation of the harp there, the harp's there, and you could actually miss that next to the king, the harp. Now, we know that the harp is absolutely valid in history. We know that angels are always depicted with harps. We know that harps and unicorns, oddly enough, all have this mythical tale about them. And we saw in another church, we saw a female minotaur. So I'll leave that for you to somehow, if you wish to make the connection between the harp, angels and harps, the minotaur, the king on the scrolls. It all has a distinct connection to Priory, that's for sure, which is quite nice. I say most of the church is designated to the Bethel family, or to say is worthwhile looking at, as it were. The tiling again, this is reclaimed tile. This isn't in 1844. This is reclaimed tile from an earlier stage. You can see that very clearly. And we can almost see the demon's wheel, the devil's wheel there, if we look at it with the spokes and things. We've got the fleur-de-lis on each different point. Now, we can also say that this is the Samnor Amur, the Samnor Amur. These are the 8 points of perfection, the 8 circles of the line, the 8 lines, the 8 pathways. Which one would go through in life to have various things represent? That's certainly covered in some of the Templar philosophies of the actual period. So, all in all, it's a very nice church. Sadly not used a great deal, but again, it has its benefit. It gets preserved because it hasn't got that many humans coming in to touch everything and damage things. But it's certainly a nice little church, worth a visit. In particular, I quite liked over there on the main altar, we won't go back there again, but there's some of the very large Bibles, absolutely humongous, and I know you've got some stills of that. But the Bibles that are here are actually over 200 years old, which are amazing to see. And this one is actually slightly older than that. I don't know if you had a look at all yet. And this one is certainly, and I like the fact it's on a side. I don't really want to leave it on a side. I think we're going to turn it over to probably Job, actually. Let's find, no, I don't Esther. Let's do Job. That sounds much more fitting for the occasion and the season. Oops. So we'll try and leave it there if we can. But you can see the age of the book is absolutely wonderful, really. And one in particular, which I particularly like, Matthew 5:28, which is, I made a covenant with mine eyes, why then should I think upon a maid? For what portion of God is there from above, and what inheritance the Almighty from on high? Is not destruction to the wicked, and a strange punishment to the workers of inquiry? Doth not he see my ways and count all my steps? And that particular part in Job, certainly in Matthew 5:28, I always think is quite interesting because it covers about that one's journey is one's own journey, and it's whether you want to see the path ahead of you, whether you actually travel that. So it's more of a philosophical statement rather than a religious statement, which is quite interesting, which I always find the Job aspects are actually quite profound, quite definitive. So this is the point there. It's a very nice church, worth a visit.